The morning I stood in front of my landlord and told him I had a fiancée, I had never even held hands with a woman who wasn't my sister. That single lie, spoken in a moment of panic, was about to change the entire direction of my life, and I did not know it yet as the words left my mouth and hung in the cold hallway air like smoke that refused to disappear. Before we go further into this story, if you believe in kindness, in forgiveness, in hope, and in the quiet miracle of second chances, I want to invite you to like this video, leave a comment, share it with someone who needs a little hope today, and subscribe to our channel. Our community grows stronger every time someone new joins our family here, and stories like this one are only possible because of viewers like you who choose to believe that good things can still happen to ordinary people. Now let me tell you how a foolish lie, told out of desperation, turned into the most unexpected and beautiful truth of my life. My name is Thomas Whitfield, and at the time this story begins, I was 31 years old, living in a modest one-bedroom apartment on the third floor of a building on Maple Grove Avenue, in a mid-sized town where everyone seemed to know everyone else's business, whether they wanted to or not. I worked as an accountant for a small firm downtown, the kind of job that paid enough to survive but never enough to feel secure, and I had spent the last 6 years quietly rebuilding my life after a broken engagement that left me more cautious than bitter, though some days it was hard to tell the difference. My fiancée at the time, a woman named Catherine, had left 2 weeks before our wedding, citing doubts she said she could no longer ignore, and though I understood her honesty was its own kind of kindness, it did not make the silence in my apartment any easier to bear in the months that followed. My landlord was a man named Walter Higgins, a widower in his late 60s who had inherited the building from his father and ran it with the strict, old-fashioned values of a man who believed that stability was the foundation of a good life. Walter was not cruel, but he was firm, and he had very particular opinions about who made a good tenant. He often said that a man without roots was a man who could disappear at any moment, leaving behind unpaid rent and empty promises, and he had grown increasingly suspicious of tenants who lived alone, worked long hours, and kept mostly to themselves, which described me perfectly. Walter had recently decided, after a series of bad experiences with tenants who broke leases and vanished in the night, that he wanted to convert several units in the building into family housing, prioritizing tenants who could demonstrate long-term stability, which in his mind meant marriage, children, or at the very least, a serious engagement. The morning everything changed, Walter knocked on my door holding a clipboard and wearing the expression of a man who had already made up his mind about something before he opened his mouth. He told me, without much preamble, that he was reviewing all the leases in the building and that single tenants living alone in the larger units, like mine, were being asked to either downsize to a smaller unit on the ground floor or vacate by the end of the following month, so that he could offer the space to families who needed the room more than I apparently did. I remember the way my stomach dropped, not because the ground floor unit was so terrible, but because I had spent 3 years slowly making that apartment into something that felt like home, hanging photographs of my parents, arranging my grandmother's old bookshelf under the window where the afternoon light came in just right, and the thought of losing it, of starting over again in a smaller, darker space, felt like one more small defeat added to a pile that was already too high. In a moment of pure panic, without any real plan or forethought, I heard myself telling Walter that he had misunderstood my situation, that I was not, in fact, living alone in the way he assumed, because I was engaged to be married, and that my fiancée and I were simply waiting until after the wedding to move her belongings in officially, out of respect for her mother's old-fashioned sensibilities about young couples living together before marriage. I do not know where the words came from. They simply arrived, fully formed, as though some cornered part of me had been waiting for an opportunity to invent an entire relationship out of thin air rather than lose the one place in the world that still felt like mine. Walter's entire demeanor shifted the moment I said it. His shoulders relaxed, his eyes softened, and he told me that this changed things considerably, that a man about to be married was exactly the kind of stable, long-term tenant he was hoping to keep in the building, and that he would be delighted to meet my fiancée sometime soon. Perhaps even invite the two of us to the small tenant appreciation dinner he was planning to host in his own apartment on the ground floor in 3 weeks' time, an event where he intended to announce which tenants would be offered renewed long-term leases with reduced rent increases as an incentive for stability. He shook my hand, told me congratulations, and walked back down the hallway whistling an old tune I vaguely recognized from my childhood, leaving me standing in my doorway with the sudden, sickening realization of exactly what I had just done. For the rest of that day, I told myself it did not matter, that I would simply find a way to quietly correct the misunderstanding before the dinner, perhaps by telling Walter that the engagement had fallen through, or that my fiancée was too busy with work to attend, and the whole situation would fade away like so many small embarrassments do. But as the days passed, I found myself unable to summon the courage to unravel the lie, partly out of pride, and partly because a small, foolish part of me had begun to enjoy the way Walter looked at me differently now, with a kind of respect and warmth he had never shown me before, as though I had finally become the kind of man worth taking seriously. I told myself I would figure it out later. I did not yet understand how quickly later has a way of arriving. 2 weeks before the dinner, I sat in my apartment one Saturday afternoon, staring at the invitation Walter had slid under my door, addressed to Thomas Whitfield and his lovely fiancée, and felt the full weight of my foolishness settle over me like a heavy coat I could not remove. I had, at various points, considered asking a coworker to pretend to be my fiancée for one evening, but every version of that plan felt more humiliating than simply telling the truth, and every version of telling the truth felt like it would cost me not just the apartment, but Walter's newfound respect, which, I realized with some surprise, had come to matter to me more than I expected. I was sitting there, turning the invitation over in my hands, when I heard a knock at my door, firm and unhurried, the kind of knock that belongs to someone who is not in a rush and is not afraid of whatever answer they might receive. I opened the door to find a woman I had never seen before, standing in the hallway with an expression that was somehow both amused and entirely serious. She looked to be around my age, with dark reddish hair pulled back loosely, wearing a simple green coat against the early autumn chill, and she held a small potted plant in one hand as though she had just come from buying it and had not yet decided where it belonged. Before I could ask who she was or how I could help her, she said, in a calm and almost conversational tone, that she had just moved into the building 2 floors below, that Walter had mentioned to her, while helping her carry boxes up the stairs, that one of his tenants was in a rather unusual predicament involving an invented fiancé, and that she had come upstairs because, in her words, she heard I needed one. I stood there in complete silence for what felt like a full minute, my mind struggling to process the fact that Walter had apparently told a total stranger about my situation, and that this stranger was now standing in my hallway, offering, with a straight face, to help me pretend to be engaged to her. Her name, she told me once I finally found my voice enough to ask, was Margaret Ellery, though she said almost everyone called her Meg, and she explained, with a kind of dry humor that immediately put me slightly at ease despite the absurdity of the moment, that she had overheard enough of Walter's story to piece together what had likely happened, that I was clearly a man who had told an impulsive lie to protect something that mattered to him, and that she found something oddly sympathetic in that, having once done something not entirely dissimilar herself, though she did not elaborate further at the time. I invited her in, mostly because I did not know what else to do with a stranger who had just offered to become my fiancé, and we sat at my small kitchen table while she explained her reasoning with a practicality that surprised me. She told me she had recently moved to town after a difficult divorce, that she was starting over in nearly every sense of the word, new job, new apartment, new city, and that she had no particular attachment to romantic pretenses or grand gestures, but that she understood, perhaps better than most people, what it felt like to be afraid of losing the one stable thing you had left. She said that if I was willing to accept her help, she would attend the dinner with me, play the part convincingly enough to satisfy Walter's curiosity, and then, once I had secured my lease renewal, we could quietly let the fake engagement dissolve the way such things often do, with no hard feelings and no explanations owed to anyone. I should have said no. Even as she spoke, some quiet, sensible part of me understood that agreeing to this arrangement would only deepen the lie rather than resolve it, that I would simply be trading one form of dishonesty for a more elaborate one, and that eventually, somehow, the truth would find its way to the surface, as truth so often does. But I was tired, and frightened of losing my home, and sitting across from this woman who spoke with such calm confidence about a plan that should have seemed insane, I found myself nodding and saying yes before I had fully thought through what I was agreeing to. Over the following 2 weeks, Meg and I met several times, ostensibly to prepare our story for the dinner, but our conversations gradually became about far more than logistics. I learned that she had worked for years as a hospital social worker before her divorce, helping families navigate some of the most painful moments of their lives, and that she had left the job not because she stopped caring, but because she had cared so much for so long that she had nothing left to give her own marriage, a realization that came to her too late to save it. She told me about her ex-husband, a man named Gerald, who had grown distant and resentful over the years, feeling like a lesser priority compared to the strangers she helped every day at work, until one day he simply stopped coming home for dinner, and eventually stopped coming home at all. She spoke about it without bitterness, only a kind of tired honesty, the way someone speaks about an old injury that has mostly healed but still aches when the weather changes. In turn, I found myself telling her about Catherine, about the wedding that never happened, about the quiet, humiliating weeks afterward when I had to call relatives one by one to explain that the invitations they had received were no longer valid, and about how I had spent the years since then convincing myself that I preferred being alone, that solitude was simpler and safer than the risk of being left again. Meg listened in a way that few people had listened to me before, without rushing to comfort me or minimize what I felt, simply absorbing it and occasionally asking a quiet question that made me realize I had never fully examined certain parts of my own grief. I began to look forward to our meetings not because of the elaborate cover story we were constructing, but because of the conversations that happened around the edges of it, the small moments of laughter, the comfortable silences, the sense that I was being truly seen by someone for the first time in years. The night of Walter's dinner arrived faster than I expected, and I found myself standing outside his apartment door with Meg beside me, both of us dressed slightly more formally than usual, and both of us, I think, more nervous than either of us wanted to admit. Walter greeted us warmly, ushering us into his apartment, which was decorated in the sturdy, old-fashioned style of a man who had lived through many decades and saw no reason to update his furniture simply because trends demanded it. There were perhaps 8 other tenants there, along with their families, and Walter made a point of introducing Meg to everyone as my fiancée with obvious pride, as though her presence confirmed something he had believed about me all along, that I was, underneath my quiet exterior, a man capable of building a stable and lasting life. I watched Meg navigate the evening with a grace that genuinely impressed me. She asked thoughtful questions of the other tenants, remembered small details they mentioned and referenced them later in conversation, and when Walter asked how we had met, she told a story, invented on the spot but delivered with such warmth and specific detail, about a chance encounter at a bookstore downtown, where she said I had recommended a novel to her that ended up meaning more to her than I could have known. It was such a small, specific lie, but something about the way she told it, the way her eyes met mine as she spoke, made my chest tighten with a feeling I did not immediately recognize, because it had been so long since I had felt it. For a moment, sitting there in Walter's cluttered, warmly lit living room, surrounded by strangers who believed we were in love, I found myself wishing that the story she was telling was somehow true. The dinner went better than I could have hoped. Walter announced near the end of the evening that he was offering me a renewed 3-year lease at a reduced rate, citing my upcoming marriage as exactly the kind of stability he wanted to reward, and I thanked him with a gratitude that was entirely genuine, even if the circumstances behind it were built on a foundation I knew was false. As Meg and I walked down the stairs afterward, both slightly giddy with relief that the evening had gone smoothly, she turned to me on the second-floor landing and said, quietly, that she had actually enjoyed herself more than she expected to, and I told her, with more honesty than I had planned to reveal, that I had too, more than I could easily explain. For the next several weeks, our arrangement continued in a strange, undefined way. We no longer needed to maintain the fiction for Walter's sake, since the lease was secured, but we kept finding reasons to see each other anyway, first under the pretense of maintaining our story in case Walter asked further questions, and later without any pretense at all, simply because we wanted to. We began having dinner together several times a week, sometimes at my apartment, sometimes at hers, and I found myself learning the small details of her life the way you learn the details of someone you are genuinely falling for, the way she always burned the first pancake and threw it away without comment, the way she hummed old songs under her breath while she worked, the way her laughter, when something truly delighted her, was louder and more unguarded than anything else about her. Carefully Composed exterior. I want to pause here and ask you, if this story is resonating with you so far, to think for a moment about the lies we tell not out of malice, but out of fear, and the strange, unexpected ways that kindness sometimes finds us in the middle of our worst mistakes. I would love to hear in the comments below about a time when an unexpected act of kindness changed the direction of your life, because I believe these stories matter, and I believe sharing them with each other is part of what makes our community here so special. Of course, a story built on a foundation of deception rarely stays simple for long, and ours was no exception. About 2 months after the dinner, Walter mentioned, in passing, that he was thinking of hosting an engagement party for Meg and me in the building's small courtyard, as a way of celebrating the upcoming addition to what he called his building's family, and inviting several other tenants who had grown fond of us both. I felt the old panic rising in my chest again, because what had started as a simple lie to secure a lease had somehow grown into an elaborate fiction that other people were now investing their genuine warmth and excitement into, and I did not know how to gracefully extract us from something that had taken on a life of its own. When I told Meg about Walter's plan, expecting her to share my alarm, she was quiet for a long moment before saying something that caught me completely off guard, that perhaps we should simply tell Walter the truth, not to unravel everything, but because she had come to care about my situation, and about me, enough that she no longer wanted our relationship, whatever shape it took, to be built on a foundation of lies, even small, well-intentioned ones. Her honesty frightened me, not because I disagreed with her, but because it forced me to confront a question I had been avoiding for weeks, which was whether what had grown between us was real, or whether it was simply the natural byproduct of two lonely people spending time together under artificial circumstances, mistaking convenience and proximity for something deeper. I told her I needed time to think, and she nodded, though I could see something like disappointment flicker across her face before she carefully composed it away, and for the first time since we had met, there was a distance between us that neither of us quite knew how to close. During the week that followed, I found myself unable to concentrate at work, running numbers that refused to balance, staring at spreadsheets while my mind wandered back to every conversation Meg and I had shared, every unguarded laugh, every moment when the pretense between us had felt, even briefly, like it had dissolved into something genuine. I thought about Catherine, and how her leaving had taught me to keep my guard up, to treat every relationship as a calculated risk rather than a leap of faith, and I realized, with a kind of quiet devastation, that I had been doing exactly that with Meg, treating our growing closeness as something I needed to analyze and verify before I allowed myself to believe in it, rather than simply trusting what I felt. It was Walter, of all people, who eventually forced the situation to a head, though he did not know it at the time. He knocked on my door one evening, more excited than I had ever seen him, holding a bottle of wine he said he wanted to give Meg and me as an early engagement gift, and he told me, with the kind of open sincerity that made my guilt nearly unbearable, that watching the two of us together over the past months had reminded him of his own late wife, and of the early years of their marriage, and that he had not expected, at his age, to feel so invested in the happiness of two tenants, but that he could not help himself, because he said he could see, plainly, how much I loved her, and how much she loved me in return. I stood in my doorway holding a bottle of wine meant to celebrate a lie, listening to a grieving widower describe a love he believed was real, and something inside me finally broke open. I told Walter everything, right there in the hallway, the whole truth from the very beginning, how I had lied about having a fiancé out of fear of losing my apartment, how Meg had appeared at my door offering to help maintain that lie, and how, somewhere along the way, in the middle of all our careful pretending, I had fallen in love with her for real, though I had been too afraid to admit it, even to myself, until that very moment. Walter was quiet for a long time after I finished speaking, long enough that I braced myself for him to tell me the lease was void, that he felt betrayed, that he wanted me out of the building by the end of the month after all. But instead, he set the bottle of wine down on the small table in the hallway, looked at me with an expression I can only describe as gentle amusement mixed with something deeper, and told me that he had lived long enough to know the difference between a lie and a love story that simply began in an unconventional way, and that in his experience, the two were not nearly as different as people like to believe. He told me that his own marriage had begun with a small deception of its own, one he was not ready to share that evening, but promised he would someday, and that what mattered to him was not how a love began, but whether it was real by the time it mattered. He told me, with surprising directness for a man who rarely spoke about his own feelings, that if I loved Meg, truly loved her, then I owed it to both of us to stop hiding behind fear and go tell her so, properly, honestly, without any pretense left standing between us. I remember standing there in the hallway, overwhelmed by the unexpected grace of a man I had lied to for months, and feeling something shift inside me, a kind of clarity that had been buried under layers of fear and old wounds for far too long. I went to Meg's apartment that same evening, my heart pounding in a way it had not pounded since I was a much younger man, and when she opened the door, clearly surprised to see me standing there after the distance that had grown between us over the past week, I did not wait for her to speak first. I told her everything I had told Walter, and more, that I had confessed the entire truth of our arrangement to him, that he had responded with a kindness I did not feel I deserved, and that somewhere in the middle of our elaborate lie, I had fallen in love with her, not with the version of her I had invented for Walter's benefit, but with the real woman standing in front of me, the one who burned pancakes and hummed old songs and had walked into my life offering to help a stranger simply because she recognized something of her own pain reflected in his. Meg was quiet for a long moment, and I watched a mixture of emotions move across her face, surprise, and something that looked almost like relief, before she finally spoke, telling me that she had been terrified to admit the same thing to herself, because after her divorce, she had promised herself she would never again build her happiness on a foundation she had not personally verified to be solid, and yet here she was, having done exactly that, falling for a man she met because of a lie, and finding that she did not regret a single moment of it. She told me that when she had suggested we tell Walter the truth, it was not because she wanted to end whatever was growing between us, but because she could no longer bear the thought of him celebrating something he believed was real while we both knew, or thought we knew, that it wasn't, and that she would rather risk losing everything by telling the truth than continue building something beautiful on top of something false. We stood there in her doorway for a long time, neither of us quite sure what to say next, until she finally reached out and took my hand, and told me, with a small, uncertain smile, that if I was serious about what I had just said, about loving her for real, then perhaps it was time we stopped pretending to be engaged and simply figured out, honestly and without any fabricated bookstore stories, what we actually wanted from each other. Over the following months, our relationship grew in a way that felt entirely different from the careful performance we had once maintained for Walter's benefit. We argued sometimes, small disagreements about scheduling or old habits neither of us had fully examined before living so closely intertwined, and we learned to navigate those disagreements honestly, without the polish we had once applied for an audience. I met her sister, a sharp-witted woman named Constance who initially regarded me with deep suspicion until she saw, over several dinners, how genuinely her sister had come alive again after years of quiet grief following her divorce. Meg met my parents, who had worried for years that I would never recover from Catherine's departure, and my mother told me privately, after their first dinner together, that she had not seen me laugh so easily in longer than she could remember. Walter, for his part, became something like an honorary grandfather figure to both of us, insisting on hosting dinners in his apartment every few weeks, during which he would tell increasingly elaborate stories about his late wife, stories we later learned he had never shared with anyone else in the building, as though our honesty with him had opened something in him that had been closed for a long time. He eventually told us the story of his own marriage's unconventional beginning, how he had once pretended to be a delivery driver to get close to a young woman working behind the counter of a flower shop, a young woman who would later become his wife of 41 years, and how he had always believed that love had a way of finding people through the strangest and most imperfect circumstances, if they were brave enough to let it. About a year after that first fateful knock on my door, on a bright, unremarkable Tuesday afternoon in early autumn, almost exactly 1 year from the day I had first lied to Walter about having a fiancée, I found myself standing once again in front of Meg's apartment door, though this time I was not there to confess a lie, but to ask a question I had been carrying in my chest for weeks, growing heavier and more certain with each passing day. I had spoken with Walter beforehand, partly out of habit, since he had become such an important presence in both our lives, and partly because I wanted his blessing, in whatever unofficial capacity an aging widowed landlord could offer it, and he had teared up, unexpectedly, telling me that watching our story unfold had been one of the great unexpected joys of his later years, and that his late wife would have loved Meg immensely. When Meg opened her door that afternoon, I did not have an elaborate speech prepared, nor did I need one. I simply told her the truth, the same way I had learned to tell her everything over the past year, that a lie had brought us together, but that everything since then, every honest conversation, every small kindness, every moment of genuine laughter and comfort, had been real, and that I wanted to spend the rest of my life making sure it stayed that way, if she would have me. I asked her, right there in the hallway where our story had begun, if she would marry me, not as a fiction we constructed for someone else's benefit, but as a truth we would build together, one honest day at a time. She said yes before I had even finished the question, her eyes bright with tears she made no effort to hide, and when we told Walter that evening, he insisted on breaking out a bottle of wine he had apparently been saving for months, telling us he had known, somehow, that this day was coming, and that he wanted to be among the first to celebrate it properly, with the truth fully in the open at last. Before I share how our story continues, I want to ask you something, and I hope you will take a moment to answer honestly in the comments below. Have you ever discovered that a mistake you were ashamed of turned out to be the very thing that led you towards something beautiful, something you never could have planned or predicted? I believe so many of us carry quiet shame over choices we made out of fear rather than malice, and I believe there is real healing in recognizing that even our worst moments can sometimes become the doorway to our best ones. If this story has touched you in any way, I would be so grateful if you would take a moment to like this video, leave a meaningful comment sharing your own experience, share this story with someone in your life who might need a little hope today, and subscribe to our channel so that you never miss another story from our growing family here. Meg and I were married the following spring, in a small ceremony held in the same courtyard where Walter had once planned to host our fictional engagement party, surrounded by friends, family, and nearly every tenant from our building, all of whom had come to know and love Meg over the past year and a half, unaware for most of that time of the unusual circumstances that had first brought us together. Walter, dressed in a suit that clearly had not been worn since some significant occasion decades earlier, walked Meg down a short aisle formed by folding chairs, since her own father had passed away several years before, and he cried more openly during the ceremony than I had ever seen him cry, even during the stories he told about his late wife, and when I asked him about it afterward, he simply said that some tears come from grief and some come from gratitude, and that that day, were entirely the second kind. We eventually told our closest friends and family the full story of how we met, the lie about the fiancé, Walter's unusual policy about stable tenants, Meg's unexpected knock on my door, and most people laughed in disbelief before admitting that it was, in its own strange way, one of the more romantic stories they had ever heard, precisely because it was so unplanned, so unpolished, so far from the kind of love story either of us would have designed on purpose. Constance, Meg's sister, told me at the wedding reception that she had always believed the best love stories were the ones that snuck up on people sideways, when they were too busy worrying about something else entirely to notice love quietly rearranging their lives, and I have thought about that observation many times since. We still live in that same building on Maple Grove Avenue, though we eventually moved into a slightly larger unit on the second floor once Meg became pregnant with our first child, a decision Walter approved with visible delight, telling us that he could not imagine a more fitting next chapter for the two tenants who had taught him, in his own words, that sometimes the truth needs a little help finding its way to the surface. Our daughter, whom we named Louisa after Walter's late wife, a gesture that moved him to tears once again when we told him, is now 2 years old, and Walter, despite his advancing age, insists on visiting nearly every day to read to her from an old, worn collection of storybooks that once belonged to his own children, decades ago. Looking back now, I understand that the lie I told out of fear was never really about deceiving Walter, not in the way I feared it would be judged. It was about a frightened man trying desperately to hold on to the one piece of stability he had left, without realizing that the very act of protecting that stability would open the door to something far more valuable than an apartment, a genuine, unexpected love that arrived disguised as a stranger's knock and a borrowed lie, and slowly, patiently, revealed itself to be the truest thing that had ever happened to me. I think often about how easily I could have turned Meg away that first evening, how easily fear or pride could have kept me from accepting help from a stranger, and how different my entire life would look now if I had. I share this story not to encourage anyone to lie to their landlord, or to suggest that deception is ever truly the right path forward, because I know, deeply, that the months of anxiety I carried over maintaining that fiction were real, and that the relief I felt when Walter responded with grace rather than anger was a gift I did not earn and could not have counted on. I share it instead because I believe there is something worth remembering in the way this story unfolded, that people are often kinder and more understanding than our fears predict, that second chances arrive in the most unexpected forms, sometimes wearing a green coat and carrying a small potted plant, and that the courage to finally speak the truth, even after months of avoiding it, can open doors we never knew existed. Walter passed away peacefully 2 years after our wedding, in his sleep, in the same apartment where he had once shared stories of his late wife over shared bottles of wine, and at his funeral, Meg and I stood together holding our daughter, surrounded by dozens of tenants past and present whose lives he had touched in ways both large and small, and I found myself thinking that a man who could have simply enforced his rules without curiosity or compassion had instead chosen, again and again, to see the human beings behind the leases he managed, and that his willingness to believe in second chances had quietly reshaped the entire trajectory of my life. In his will, he left specific instructions that the courtyard where we were married be renamed in honor of his late wife, and a small plaque now sits there, which Meg and I visit often with Louisa, teaching her, even now, about the man whose kindness helped write the beginning of her own family story. If you have made it this far with us, I want to thank you sincerely for spending this time in our story, and I want to ask you, before we close, to think about someone in your own life who might need to hear that their mistakes do not define them, that fear-driven choices can still lead toward genuine healing, and that it is never too late to tell the truth and let love find its way toward you honestly. Please leave a comment below sharing what this story meant to you, or sharing a moment in your own life when an unexpected kindness or a difficult truth changed everything for the better, because these stories we share with each other, in our little corner of this community, matter more than you might realize. If this story touched your heart even a little, please take a moment to like this video, leave a meaningful comment, share it with someone who might need a little hope today, and subscribe to our channel so you never miss another emotional journey like this one. Our family here continues to grow because of people like you, who believe, as I have come to believe, that kindness and forgiveness and second chances are not just comforting ideas, but real, tangible forces capable of transforming even our most foolish and fearful mistakes into the beginning of something beautiful. Thank you for walking through this story with me, and I look forward to sharing many more with you, here, in our shared home of hope and second chances.